They say big truths like to arrive dressed as public spectacles. Mine came in a hotel ballroom between the salad and the cake. I was 65 when my life bifurcated under chandeliers, while guests toasted my son Andrew's new beginning. For 35 years, I had been steady by training and habit. Tax consultant, accountant of our household, the man who fixed a leaking roof and wrote college checks. People admired Marina and admired our marriage. Few suspected the quiet fissures. That night, the cracks turned into a canyon. The rehearsal dinner gleamed with polite laughter. I sat at the head table thinking of speeches and easy pride. Marina, pristine, smiled through the small talk. Rob, introduced as her business partner, watched with a satisfaction that read like a smirk. I remember the way the room inhaled when she rose, how a hum of conversation dissolved into brittle silence. "This is the end for us. I've found someone new," she announced. The words landed like stones. Rob's gaze met mine as if the moment had been paid for and delivered. Forks froze mid-air. Andrew's face went pale. The band stuttered. I felt the heat of a dozen eyes and the cold of a stranger's betrayal. No one expected what I did next. I bowed my head politely, found a composure I did not feel, and said, "Thanks for the heads up. Thanks for making it public." I nudged a white envelope toward her plate, patted Andrew's shoulder, and left before the chorus of whispers gathered force. Her scream later confirmed the envelope held divorce papers filed that morning. That night was not the birth of suspicion. It was its reveal. 4 months' small things had unsettled me. Missing funds from our joint account, receipts for hotels I had not authorized, anniversaries bought with watches I never saw. Marina explained away questions with the practiced ease of an actor. "Business," she said, "or networking?" But when her phone lay unlocked once on the kitchen island, the messages I read were blunt. Plans, laughter, intimacies signed by a name I did not expect. I had choices that night. I could have shattered, raising my voice so everyone's memory of Andrew's wedding would be of a man reduced. I could have charged the room and made a scene. Instead, I chose strategy. Numbers are my native language. They taught me a different kind of patience. I began to watch ledgers and accounts the way other men watch faces. Tiny transfers multiplied, a secret account surfaced. Luxuries appeared that didn't line up with the modest Marina I thought I knew. An old legal parchment lived in a drawer, a marital agreement Marina had insisted upon years earlier. At the time, she praised its clarity, saying it protected our assets and kept things honest. Hidden in that agreement was a fidelity clause. Adultery, the clause said, would carry severe financial consequences. She had mocked the clause as ceremonial, a relic she meant to outlive. She never imagined the clause could become a scalpel. For 9 months, I collected a paper trail. As a financial auditor, collecting evidence was second nature. Coaxing the truth out of numbers was the work I'd always loved. I traced transfers, matched dates to receipts, and kept messages that proved intent. I recorded in our home, legally and carefully, when Marina spoke of plans to leave after the wedding. Each item stacked into a weight I could no longer ignore. When I filed that morning, it was preparation. I wanted to protect Andrew's day. I wanted to retain my dignity. Watching Marina tear open the papers and realize the public spectacle had been met with paperwork. Calm, legal, immovable, was precise. Her scream was a sound I replayed later. It was surprise braided with panic. Outside the hall, Marina chased me, furious and unsteady. She believed I'd been naive. She had assured Rob and herself that I would remain oblivious until she was gone. She had miscalculated. I told her quietly that she had 24 hours to remove her things before I changed the locks. I told her I had known about the condo application she and Rob had tried to secure. Its rejected credit check was a detail she had not anticipated me discovering. What I could not have known then, in that early flurry of humiliation and resolve, was how far the aftermath would reach. Andrew would be wounded. Family loyalties shifted. A courtroom would test our past signatures. People would choose sides. But I also could not have known how oddly freeing the work of rebuilding would feel. The small, stubborn hope of a new restaurant, recipes from my grandmother's kitchen saved for a future that suddenly seemed possible. Marina intended spectacle. I intended the consequence. The white envelope was not the end. It was the hinge. The banquet hall's echo followed me for days. People in town turned Marina's announcement into a quiet event that pulled at long-held assumptions. Gossip there works like erosion, slow and relentless. Andrew stayed at the table when I left. He sat in his tuxedo afterward, hands white on the steering wheel. When he finally stepped out, his face held a weight no father wants to see on a son. An adult's comprehension that the life he trusted had seams. He told me later the announcement felt rehearsed, like lines read from someone else's script. Marina chased me under courtyard lights and begged. Think about Andrew. Her pleading was familiar. Her panic revealed the plan had misfired. She had believed spectacle would shield her. It did not. After that night, small signs began to rearrange loyalties. Paul, Marina's brother, admitted he'd seen her with Rob but had accepted explanations. A bank manager I trusted asked if I had noticed irregular transfers. Our cook missed a week of work. Small refrains that signaled shifting alliances. The town watched like a patient audience. Marina presented two faces. Wounded matron before neighbors, schemer in private. With Rob she made lists and whispered plans. I found folded scraps with dates that matched transfers from our account. She had braided shame to theft. That combination hurt more than a public insult. Numbers became my refuge and weapon. As an auditor, I traced transfers, matched charges to receipts, and wrote them into a small black book. A secret account emerged from the pattern, recurring withdrawals timed around weekends and hotel stays, gifts that did not align with her public explanations. Each line in the ledger felt like evidence of a life I had been financing while being kept out of the story. Andrew's loyalty was complicated. He had paid tuition and worked shifts to stay in school. Marina's charity appearances sat beside those facts. He oscillated between anger and sorrow and leaned on me for steadiness. You protected us, he told me once, and in that sentence was both accusation and solace. Friends hesitated. Some offered guarded support. Others asked questions with lowered voices. When loyal acquaintances began to nudge toward truth, the social fabric that had wrapped our lives started to fray. I learned then how quickly respect can become suspicion when trust corrodes. I focused on the practical. I mapped bank transfers like a crime scene. Date, amount, recipient, invoice. Where verbal testimony would bow to emotion, paper would not. Collecting proof tempered fury with purpose. The ledger taught me patience. It also taught me that dignity could be defended by law as surely as by silence. Home changed. Rooms I had walked for decades took on new coordinates. Where bills lived, which envelopes disappeared, the drawers Marina favored. I moved through the house with a new attention, cataloging the small betrayals that became the backbone of my case. The black book filled, dates, amounts, hotels, witnesses. Paper does not forgive. It simply remembers. I had practical confrontations. The bank manager, Harris, sat across from me and slid a printout. Transactions highlighted like veins. He had known our account's contour for years and had not wanted to pry. We can flag these, Mr. Harrison, he said. But the machinery of finance takes time. That conversation taught me how institutional inertia can shelter deception. Paul's photo stayed on my table. Sometimes I lifted it and reminded myself that witnesses mattered. Proof was not cruelty, it was the language that would secure our future. Always. The public moment at the banquet had been designed to humiliate. I resolved to turn its momentum into a shield for my son, not a crucible for spectacle. Discovering the man across the table was more than a business partner felt like learning the name of an illness after worrying about symptoms for months. Rob had been introduced as practical, a consultant who could help Marina's ambitions. I had nodded, trusting my wife. I had not imagined him becoming the central instrument of her betrayal. The first hard evidence appeared when Marina left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. Reading messages meant for two people is a particular kind of violence. There was intimacy threaded through the logistics, rooms, jokes tucked between business talk, references to a future that did not include me. The texts were not theatrical, but their accumulation made the grammar of intent undeniable. They used pet names and markers of possession. My girl, hearts, calendar notes. A pattern emerged that turned small acts into a second life made in private. The cruelty in that discovery was how ordinary it felt when written in short messages. The enormity came from their steady aggregation. Rob had flattered Marina's ego and promised the private reward of attention, then suggested weekend trips that perfectly aligned with gaps in our calendar. It is a subtle kind of betrayal, flattery wrapped in plausibility, until the invoices reveal it is not business but a second household formed from our accounts. Recording became part of what I did. I placed a recorder in our home within the parameters of the law. At first, the captured audio was ordinary. Chatter, a clink of glass. Then came admissions. Marina boasting about how easy it was to shift funds. Rob laughing in a way that sounded both greedy and surprised. A casual line like, "He never reads beyond the lines," became admission when matched with bank dates. Receipts told a brazen story. Hotel suites in coastal towns, watches charged to our account and shipped elsewhere. Wire transfers timed to anniversaries when we had discussed retirement plans. A wire labeled as vendor payment led to a Portland address tied to a condo down payment. The consultant fiction thinned quickly when invoices matched transfers. Confrontation at home was inevitable. I found Marina packing, shirts folded, a passport tucked into a pocket. I placed the ledger printouts and a selection of recordings on the counter. She moved through denial, anger, and panic with practiced speed. "You can't do this," she said breathless, as if the law might be slow enough to save a plan. Rob, when pressed by associates, played plausible partner. He offered plausible deniability and left sentences open enough to be both honest and dishonest. His charm, Marina read it as devotion, looked in truth like strategic investment in someone who could open access to funds. What surprised me was their belief in impunity. Carelessness, repeated transfers, small withdrawals, half-hidden vendor names, betrayed arrogance. Their behavior gave me the evidence I needed. By the time I had matched texts, recordings, and transfers, the banquet spectacle was joined by a lattice of proof. The evidence was not poetic. It was functional. It gave direction and allowed me to move from humiliation toward a plan that could be presented in a courtroom. Unraveling the paper trail felt like following a river from mouth back to source. Money bears the marks of movement, routing numbers, timestamps, memo lines. After decades of reading such signs for clients, I applied that skill to the ledger of my own life. The first substantive discovery was a personal account Marina had opened under another name, funded by split transfers routed through intermediary accounts to disguise origin. It was simple and clever. Regular small transfers that snowballed into a sum large enough to matter. Seeing months of withdrawals total into a figure large enough to be deliberate chilled me in a way an isolated charge never had. I confronted Harris at the bank with the pattern I had assembled. He was embarrassed. Institutions prefer not to be accused. He agreed to flag certain transactions and provided statements beyond what the online portal showed. His cooperation bought me documentation and time. It also revealed how slow institutional gears can be when facing a clever patient fraud. One wire caught my eye, a vendor payment that traced to a Portland address and then to a shell front. Cross-checking property records showed a condo down payment matching a transfer. It was brazen rather than elegant. Marina had been funding a second life with a partner posing as a business ally. Each thread produced another knot, a watch sent to a courier in another state, hotel folios listing 2 guests under different names, cash withdrawals around anniversaries that left unanswered questions. I copied everything, organized it with paper clips, and updated the small black notebook until it felt less like memory and more like evidence. Paul's eyewitness account was vital. He described evenings he saw Marina and Rob together, certain restaurants they favored, and moments he had glossed over. His testimony gave human shape to the ledger's cold lines. Courts do not prefer motives without corroboration. Paul provided that corroboration. I found how people hide money with the naivety of confidence. Rob had formed companies with harmless names and issued consulting invoices that matched many of the transfers. Once invoices aligned with bank dates, the fiction unraveled quickly. The consulting narrative gave them plausible deniability. Dates and deposits stripped that cloak away. Evidence produced both sorrow and a form of vindication. Sorrow because mutual trust had been siphoned into trips and trinkets. Vindication because numbers do not lie. That clarity kept me from acting in a way that would have burned Andrew's wedding into memory's ruin. I met with a lawyer to outline strategy. We discussed the fidelity clause buried in the agreement Marina once championed, an irony not lost on me. My lawyer explained how consistent patterns of financial transfers coinciding with acts of infidelity could make a clause enforceable. Evidence and intent mattered. When I presented the folder, the lawyer paged through printouts and said, "We can file, we can seek preliminary measures to preserve assets." Those words felt like the start of a fight I had prepared for in silence. That night I placed the folder in a locked briefcase and sat with weak coffee while the house creaked. I had chosen legal method over spectacle. The ledger had made that choice possible. I slept poorly, but I carried the comfort of a plan and the prospect of closure. The lake house had been the geography of family life. Summer evenings, fishing, a place I taught Andrew to bait a hook. Standing in its kitchen with a folder of printouts felt like remapping a place I had trusted. Marina discovered the divorce packet and moved through shock to rage. "You can't do this," she said. "Think of the years." She yanked a closet open and produced a small suitcase, half-packed as if departure had been timed. I laid out hotel folios, wire confirmations, and invoices. The pattern was plain: transfers timed with trips, vendor lines masking personal purchases, recurring withdrawals that matched nights she called business. The paper does not respond to rhetoric. The ledger spoke with necessary bluntness. Years earlier, Marina insisted we sign a marital agreement. She praised its clarity. Buried inside was Section 15, a fidelity clause tying financial consequence to adulterous conduct. I read it aloud. Her face shifted from fury to disbelief as if the clause were an unexpected accusation. She begged and bargained, plans to repay, to unwind purchases, to sell assets privately. I listened because fairness requires listening. I refused because words without restitution were air. Paul arrived with a photograph and an admission. He had seen Marina with Rob months earlier and had accepted explanations. His confession added human corroboration to the ledger's lines. She tried to recenter the tale on loneliness and longing. "You were never there," she said, seeking sympathy by blaming distance. I felt the old ache of a husband whose presence had been misread. But her claim did not alter transfers, invoices, or hotel folios. Facts, when assembled, are stubborn. I then set a boundary. "You have 24 hours to remove your belongings," I told her. After that, I changed the locks. The ultimatum was pragmatic, a measure to prevent further manipulation and protect what had been built for Andrew's future. She packed with brisk efficiency, choosing photographs and sentimental items and little else. On the porch she paused and looked at me with something that might have been regret or calculation, then left with a set of keys I intended to revoke. During the confrontation, I also told her about the condo application she and Rob had submitted. The manager's office had called months earlier about a credit check and I had handled the call as household finance. The application had failed in a way their plan had not anticipated. Rob lacked the credit she promised, an inconvenient truth that undermined their confidence. After she left, I copied files, contacted our lawyer, and began lining up witnesses and timelines. The marital agreement, Marina's instrument, felt suddenly like a tool I would wield fairly. My lawyer advised the clause, paired with documentation and testimony, could support requests to preserve assets pending adjudication. The house seemed to breathe again. I walked to the dock and looked at the still water, thinking of small duties. Deposit copies with counsel, notify the bank of suspicious activity, prepare a chronology for court. Protection, I realized, is the accumulation of small, precise acts. When Andrew learned Marina had gone, he asked questions that sought facts, not fury. His steadiness steadied me. Protecting a son's future is less an act of spectacle than the slow work of assembling proof and presenting truth where rumor once ruled. Night settled on the lake house. I locked the folder in a briefcase and felt an odd calm. The path forward was legal and clear. The next steps would be procedural. Filings, hearings, testimony. But they were mine to do. The lake house was no longer a prize to be won. It was a life to be defended. Money tells stories in a voice that cannot be shamed. I learned to listen to that voice the way a violinist listens for the slightest flat note. After months of quiet observation, the ledger spoke with a clarity that gossip never could. I had started keeping a small black book, a habit that felt like survival rather than curiosity, where I logged every odd transfer, every anonymous vendor name, and every weekend that matched a hotel invoice. Numbers are neutral. Their accumulation is not. When the pattern became a map, I began to see a second life taking shape behind my wife's polite smile. The first discovery that made my chest hollow was a personal account opened under a different name, routed through 3 intermediary transfers to hide the origin. It was clever in a domestic way. Small amounts that grew until the balance read like a deliberate amassment, not a stray expense. The construction of the fraud was decent enough to fool casual scrutiny. It took a trained eye to notice the regular cadence. I met with Harris, my bank manager, and felt his discomfort when I slid printouts across the table. "We try not to be involved in scandals," he said, but his hand trembled as he highlighted transfers. He provided statements that extended beyond the platitudes of the online portal. Those pages gave context to several invoices that once looked like tidy business expenses. Invoices are a kind of confession. One line read like a small joke, "Consulting fee, Robson Partners." A vendor name linked to a shell that, when cross-checked with property records, led to a Portland condo with a down payment suspiciously timed. A watch listed as a corporate gift bore a courier address in Florida. The sums were not cataclysmic in isolation. Together they made a life. I kept the data with ritual care. Copies, photocopies, printouts with dates circled, red-threaded notes. A map of movements formed across the pages. Hotel stays on the same weekends Marina claimed to be at networking events. Wire transfers at midnight, small cash withdrawals the day after long dinners. Those small withdrawals were a tell. Petty cash for 2 people who did not want their names on receipts. Paul's testimony became a crucial human note in a ledger dominated by numbers. He told of a night in a restaurant where he had found Marina leaning close to Rob, the angle of their conversation intimate in a way he had previously dismissed because he loved his sister and wanted to believe her. He felt foolish now, he told me, and that admission gave the ledger a living witness. Recording certain conversations was a move I made with a legal mind toward preservation, not malice. In our jurisdiction, one-party consent allowed me to place a recorder in the home office. The first files were ambient noise, later recordings captured lines I could not ignore, laughter stitched with plans to get out, and casual remarks about moving funds. Matching those recordings with dates in my black book turned conjecture into evidence. Rob's charm was calculated. He could speak like a boardroom man and smile like a lover. The invoices, when paired with the recordings, read as a partnership built on mutual exploitation. One person promising love, the other promising access to a life funded by someone else's kindness. It was ugly in its ordinariness. When I presented my findings to the attorney I had quietly consulted, his eyebrows lifted only where professional detachment permitted. "This is actionable," he said. "We can file motions to freeze assets, seek temporary restraining orders, and present this as evidence of willful dissipation of marital assets." The phrase willful dissipation tasted clinical and sharp. It meant someone had been siphoning funds for a purpose that was not marital welfare. There was a moral calculus in every decision. I owed Andrew a childhood unbent by spectacle and bills that kept their lives afloat. I owed myself a chance to hold on to dignity. Law offered language. Numbers offered proof. Together they formed a strategy that was neither cruel nor performative. It was necessary. Filing court papers the morning of the wedding was more than a legal move. It was a statement of priorities. I wanted Andrew's night to be remembered for his vows, not my ruin. The quiet mechanics of freezing accounts would protect his inheritance more than the most theatrical confrontation. When Marina tore the envelope that evening, the fact that it contained filings and not a speech felt like an axis shift. The fight was no longer only between 2 people. It had become an institutional process where evidence mattered. Paperwork is not poetry, but when your life is in play, it becomes the instrument of rescue. Each printout, each highlighted transaction, was a barrier against further theft. The bank's cooperation, reluctant and cautious, proved vital. They could not reverse months of transactions, but they could slow new ones. As I closed the folder that night, the weight of the evidence settled into a heavy quiet. Collecting proof is not vengeance in itself. It is a framework for justice. I told myself that often when sleep was thin and the house felt too large. The ledger had kept me honest in ways words could not. I rested, not because the war was over, but because the first line had been written. Tomorrow would bring hearings, but tonight I allowed myself a small, measured relief indeed. Contracts are brittle promises until one party remembers to read them aloud. I had kept our marital agreement in a manila envelope for years because Marina insisted it gave her security. She praised its clauses at dinners and waved it as proof of foresight, calling it a necessity for any prudent marriage. We joked about lawyers and clauses, but I had not imagined I would ever be reading Section 15 in a courtroom as a pivot of consequence. The irony was a quiet humor that steadied me. Section 15 was written in legal precision, a fidelity clause that tied financial distribution to behavior. If either spouse engaged in adultery, the offending party would forfeit a substantial portion of joint assets. At the time, Marina celebrated the clause as protection. Later, that same clause would become the scalpel to dissect her plan. There is an odd intimacy in reading legalese when your life depends on it. The clause spoke in conditional phrasing, mapping out outcomes in sterile syllables. Forfeiture upon proof of infidelity, judicial discretion permitted to account for the impact on children's disposition, and measures to preserve assets. Reading it, I felt both absurd and liberated. Absurd because the document had once been a point of marital negotiation, liberated because language had become leverage. My attorney, a pragmatic woman named Claire, advised measured steps. We cannot rely on the clause alone, she told me. We must show intent, willful dissipation, a pattern that demonstrates the funds shifted for non-marital benefit. Her voice mapped the legal strategy like a cartographer. Section 15 was a tool, but a tool that required preparation and corroboration. We began to assemble an evidentiary narrative. Transfers matched with incriminating recordings, testimonies from witnesses like Paul, and the ledger's chronology. Claire emphasized that the law needed a story it could believe. Numbers and human testimony braided into a convincing arc of misconduct. Evidence is not merely proof of transactions. It is a story with motive and opportunity. Emotion mingled with procedure in ways I had not expected. I felt no triumph in turning a clause Marina had once championed into an instrument against her. My satisfaction was functional and small. The clause could shield our son's inheritance, secure the lake house, and prevent further depletion. Morally, I rationalized the action as protection rather than punishment. We filed motions to freeze accounts and requested emergency preservation orders. The judge assigned to our case was known for meticulousness and a distaste for spectacle masquerading as truth. I felt lucky for procedural sobriety. The last thing I wanted was a bench swayed by theatrical cries or performative repentance. The first hearing was a formality of tension. Court clerks moved papers with habitual detachment while we waited. Claire presented the preliminary package: statements, bank printouts, recordings, and Paul's written account. The judge reviewed the documents with a practiced eye and asked for clarifications that revealed gaps where Marina had hoped ambiguity would shield her. Marina's counsel argued that the clause was unenforceable due to lapse and that transfers were business expenses. It was a tight pivot. Business versus adultery. Claire countered by showing alignment between dates of transfers and recorded admissions, exposing how invoices masked personal purchases. The courtroom felt less like a theater and more like a mechanized truth machine, where facts were fed into a calibrated engine. There was a moment when Marina took the stand in a hearing wearing composure like armor. She spoke of loneliness, of unmet needs, and of a desire for connection. Those statements could move a jury. They carried the sound of someone seeking empathy. But our evidence did not ask the court to adjudicate desire. It asked the court to adjudicate conduct tied to marital resources. That distinction, desire versus dissipation, matters because the law operates on impacts. The judge asked for supplemental documentation, ordered freezes to prevent further asset movement. It was not vengeance. It was preservation. It felt like a very small victory on behalf of Andrew and the life we had worked to build. Public reaction did not calm. Neighbors took sides, and the scandal threaded itself into Sunday brunch talk. Marina's friends rallied a narrative of midlife desperation, while others could not reconcile her behavior with the woman they had known. The clause, which had once seemed like a formal curiosity, now shaped social judgments as neatly as legal outcomes. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about justice and mercy. The clause demanded proof, facts not feelings, and I believed in meeting that demand. I also believed, naively or fiercely, that exposing the truth would allow space for repair that did not involve betrayal or theft. My hope was never to humiliate unnecessarily. It was to ensure consequences and boundaries. As the weeks passed, the legal process tightened around the evidence. The judge ordered a forensic review of our accounts and granted preliminary measures to preserve property. Section 15, once decorative, became structural. The clause redirected the flow of decisions toward restitution rather than indulgence. In the lull between filings and hearings, I found odd pockets of clarity. I returned to my grandmother's recipes, to the idea of opening a small place where honest food would be a new project. The clause had changed the trajectory of our conflict, but it had also given me a chance to choose a different life path. The law protected the past. The kitchen promised the future. A plan is a quiet architecture. Its foundation is patience and the willingness to assemble truth brick by brick. After I learned how Marina and Rob had stitched their second life out of small thefts and brazen promises, I spent 9 months as an invisible architect. My days were the same outwardly: client meetings, tax returns, neighborhood greetings, while inwardly I reconstructed our finances like a crime scene investigator at a kitchen table. The work felt practical, even prayerful. It was my way of channeling the humiliation into something that could protect my son. I hired Claire quietly, meeting in her office under pretenses that felt less dramatic than they were. We discussed thresholds, how much evidence would compel a judge to act, what constituted willful dissipation, and how to preserve assets without escalating a spectacle that might harm Andrew. Our plan was surgical. Gather, document, and preserve. Gathering meant meticulous habits. Every bank statement had to be checked against receipts. Every vendor name needed verification. Every hotel folio had to be matched with calendar entries. There were nights when the house seemed to hold its breath as I transferred digits, highlighted lines, and inked dates into a black book. For a man who had once measured life in columns and ledgers, this felt like both punishment and salvation. I also rehearsed my public face. The night of Andrew's wedding had to remain Andrew's night. So I dressed in composure during family events, hid my mounting files away, and maintained the ritual of being a father. My son trusted me in ways divorced from marital complexity. Protecting that trust was a prime directive. I told myself that silence, when paired with preparation, is not weakness but strategy. Files accumulated, email threads, courier receipts, canceled checks, and recordings that captured offhand remarks revealing intent. I cataloged everything in folders labeled by date, then copied them into binders, and then into digital backups. Data is fragile without redundancy. When you suspect deception, redundancy becomes a moral act. Timing mattered. If I filed too early, I risked exposing Andrew to a scandal midstream. If I filed too late, Marina's dissipations could empty accounts. The calculus was agonizing. Claire and I mapped a window, after final wedding details but before any planned disappearance. The morning of the wedding became the hinge. Papers filed quietly at the courthouse, emergency preservation orders prepared in the lawyer's briefcase, envelopes printed and sealed in my coat pocket. I collected witnesses carefully. Paul's confession was significant. Harris, the bank manager, would provide institutional testimony. Even a former vendor who had been paid cash agreed to a deposition once I explained the stakes. None of them sought spectacle. They sought truth. Their cooperation felt like a small community of rectitude. I practiced restraint in ways that felt spiritual. There were evenings when I wanted to shout or to throw the binders into the courtyard and announce everything. Instead, I made coffee, reviewed a ledger, and remembered that my son's night was not a stage for my collapse. The architecture of patience required that I hold myself in check until the proper door could be opened. There were practical steps beyond evidence. I moved certain savings into accounts I controlled, legal and above-board but protective. I separated funds intended for Andrew's future and set them aside as clearly documented trust-like reserves. It felt awkward, like planning for war inside a marriage, but necessary. On the day I filed, my hands did not tremble as much as I expected. The courthouse smelled of paper and municipal resolve. Claire filed documents with precise motions. Civil clerks accepted them as they do for any well-ordered case. When I stepped outside the courthouse after filing, a rain had begun, fine and insistent. It felt apt, a kind of cleansing punctuation. That night at the banquet hall, I sat through toasts, making small talk and tasting the irony of my calm. When Marina stood and delivered her line, the plan did not feel like revenge. Sliding the sealed envelope toward her plate was a controlled act, a transfer of responsibility rather than performance. I wasn't ending a marriage with a flourish. I was activating the protection we had quietly built. The morning after, with filings in place and preliminary orders requested, we began the procedural path. The court, once engaged, would act in measured ways. The architecture had to be legal and ethical. Our hands had to be clean. I had learned that those who pursue justice wrongfully often become the very thing they opposed. In the months of hush and calculation, I often caught myself sketching menus. Pasta choices, sauces, small tables of two, little daydreams that felt less like escapism and more like reclamation. Planning a restaurant was selfish in a new way. It was a life built for me, not a life devised for someone else's approval. The kitchen would become a place of public warmth where business and betrayal could be replaced by honest service. Preparation taught me a different dignity. Patience as purpose and paperwork as a promise to my son. Each page a small vow until the day the judge finally listened. I carried that resolve like a living ledger daily. The house remembers the weight of your footsteps long after you stop walking. That memory turned heavy the morning Marina left. She returned after the banquet like someone moving with purpose. Suitcase half-packed, lipstick smudged, a voice tuned to accusation. Between the slam of the front door and the kettle's worried whistle, she demanded to know why an envelope had been left at her place setting that night. I pointed to the counter where the packets lay. Spreadsheets, printed emails, hotel folios, and recordings labeled by date. The sight of those pages made whatever armor she wore crack. "Are you proud?" she spat. "Do you want applause?" There was performative outrage in her words, but behind them I heard a calculus. If she framed the scene as her own suffering, perhaps the theft could be rationalized away by sympathy. People do that. Turn fault into narrative. It was my job then to keep the ledger true. I read section 15 aloud. The legal phrasing, conditional, precise, landed with an odd gravity in the kitchen where we had once argued over bills and recipes. She listened as if hearing a script she had once written being turned against her. For a moment she looked older, smaller. The arrogance that had lubricated her schemes bled into shock. Paul arrived, breathless, a man who had once defended his sister and now carried the weight of confession. He placed a photograph and a receipt on the counter and sat heavily. "I saw them together months ago," he told me, voice ragged with regret. I wanted to believe her. His admission translated gossip into testimony, a human corroboration that made the numbers palpable. Andrew came to the lake house later, Tuck still smelling faintly of cologne and rain. He had watched the announcement unfold and carried the spectacle home like a bruise. He looked at Marina with a combination of grief and anger that cleaved speech into blunt facts. "You lied to us," he said. "You took from our family." His steadiness, born of nights working 2 jobs and saving, gave the moment a poor man's dignity I had always admired. Marina pleaded the sort of things people plead when cornered. Loneliness, unmet needs, a life eaten by routine. She offered to repay, now, immediately, if I would avoid the court. It was a theater of bargaining. But the ledger was not moved by words. The transactions showed intent, and the recordings documented plans to get out and enjoy a life already funded. I set a boundary with a single sentence. 24 hours to gather her things. After that, I said, the locks change. It was an ultimatum designed not from cruelty but from necessity. If she had access, she could continue dissipating funds or erasing evidence. Boundaries are sometimes the least theatrical acts of love. As she packed, the house rearranged itself. Photographs were taken down with mechanical fingers. A small box of letters was chosen with care. She left with a few sentimental objects and a passport. Items that spoke of a life she still imagined was possible beyond consequence. On the porch she hesitated, and for a moment the woman I had loved and the woman who had lied intersected in a single frame. The court issued preliminary freezes that same week. Harris at the bank cooperated enough to place holds on joint accounts pending further orders. There were practical steps too. I notified financial partners, secured certain retirement accounts into protected designations, and asked Claire to file for emergency preservation orders. The work was procedural but necessary. Marina tried to sway friends with texts blaming my conservatism and proclaiming newfound happiness, but her story clashed with invoices and witness statements. Reputation is fragile. Truth has a stubborn way of aligning people. Rob's creditworthiness had been insufficient for the condo application he and Marina had submitted. That small failure became an unforeseen wedge in their plan. Business partners who once praised him sounded cautious. The neighborhood reacted in small ways. Greeting cards returned unopened, polite nods replaced with guarded distance. I received a call from an old client who spoke to me in careful measured words. Loyalty was now something people judged against a background of evidence. It was painful in its quiet. In the days after she left, I cataloged statements and reached out to a vendor who had provided service for one of the trips. A courier confirmed the delivery address. Small confirmations of the ledger's lines arrived like slow, steady rain. Those small procedural victories felt like steady stones across a rushing river. They mattered. At night, I walked the dock, watching the lake's dark mirror. Betrayal narrowed but did not extinguish hope. Rebuilding would be long, court hearings and testimony, but a clear path existed. I called our retirement account custodian and moved funds into a protective designation. Claire drafted notice to creditors. Harris confirmed he would hold suspicious transactions. A vendor agreed to testify about a suspicious shipment. Those steps, small and bureaucratic, felt like bridges across a current. The locks were changed. The house found a quieter rhythm, less triumph, more a holding pattern, until the courtroom took up the next chapter. Bonds fray quietly until a single act makes the damage audible in a town that loves its stories. Within days, the household phone carried gossip and blunt demands. Old acquaintances asking if the rumors were true, creditors calling, neighbors shifting allegiances. The community reprocessed scandal into social logic. People sorted themselves. Andrew wavered between filial love and the discovery of betrayal. He asked plainly, why hide it? It was not about money alone but the erosion of the story his childhood was built upon. His question landed with a sharp honesty that forced me to account not merely for accounts but for the narrative that had defined our family. Paul attempted to bridge the gaps. He apologized awkwardly and then, more painfully, to Andrew. He felt complicit in a story he had once enabled through inattention. Confession reshaped him into an ally. His testimony would carry weight. Loyalty had moral weight here. The man who had once suppressed a truth now made himself a lever for it. Marina oscillated between public defiance and private erosion. Friends sent concerned letters. Colleagues and partners asked pointed questions. Her attempt to frame events as a midlife quest could not withstand ledgers and witnesses. Storytelling works only until verifiable records intervene. Rob first defended Marina, then became curt and began to miss meetings. His investor conversations thinned. Men who build on borrowed access retreat when credit runs dry. Within weeks he moved in a different circle. The image of him smiling across a reception table became less plausible as partners began to ask for paperwork. Local press and blogs traced transactions and spread the story. A tabloid headline amplified the scandal and social media followed. The narrative shifted from private betrayal to public cautionary tale. Marina's name became shorthand for duplicity. People who had once attended their dinner parties now parsed the facts into warnings for younger neighbors. Financially, the court's preliminary freezes were crucial. Harris at the bank confirmed no further large transfers could be initiated. Claire filed an emergency motion to secure the lake house and to protect joint investments earmarked for Andrew's future. Legal machinery, though sluggish, created a temporary bedrock amid social erosion. Marina fought in small legal ways. Motions to unfreeze accounts, petitions claiming the clause was unenforceable, and every move required a response. Each filing demanded more documentation, more depositions, and more time. The rhythm of litigation replaced the rhythm of our home. Day by day, the legal calendar mapped out the fight. At one hearing, Marina's counsel argued with theatrical energy that the fidelity clause was punitive and antiquated. He called for discretion and urged sympathy. Claire responded with focused precision, laying out the documented transfers and recordings in a way that framed financial movement as willful dissipation. The judge listened with a careful neutrality that felt like a rudder steering a small, troubled ship. Andrew's role evolved. He joined meetings with Claire, sat through depositions, and learned the language of trusts and designations. He presented himself in court with the humility of someone who had learned the hard arithmetic of responsibility. Seeing him move from wounded spectator to engaged participant felt like a quiet relief. Marina's social network thinned. A supplier who had offered her credit called to say their business relationship should be put on hold. A client dropped a planned collaboration. Being at the center of litigation is a business risk. It makes associations costly. Social isolation, more than any legal penalty, became one of her steepest consequences. Rob, untethered, became a cautionary footnote. He posted a vague message about new horizons, but the damage had momentum. Acquaintances noticed his absence from civic groups. Others whispered about sudden alliances. The man who once looked like proof of Marina's future now resembled an uneven investment. Through it all, I made careful choices to keep the defense practical and unperformative. The work was about preservation of assets, of Andrew's future, and of a moral economy where theft is recognized as theft. I resisted public theatrics. Claire advised that optics could be dangerous, distracting from precise legal work. That restraint paid off in small victories. Accounts remained frozen, the lake house stayed provisionally protected, and creditors were notified. Each administrative gain felt less like a trophy and more like a brace for a structure under strain. At home, when the phone rested and the house collected itself, I tested sauces and sketched menus. The small acts of creation, mixing dough, tasting a sauce, were as honest as any legal filing. Rebuilding a life after betrayal was not only about contesting the past, it was about tending a future where honor might be practiced openly and deliciously. The town would talk. People would pick sides. Yet between filings and dinner menus I watched a life recalibrate toward truth, steadied by law and by the small, stubborn acts of making. Courtroom mornings smell of coffee and paper and a civility that pretends it can contain boiling truths. I sat on that bench like a man waiting to hear verdicts about things he had once thought private. My evidence folder felt heavier than the briefcase I'd carried to first day of school ceremonies. It carried months of ledgers, recordings, and the small book where I had tracked transfers in ink and habit. Claire opened the case with legal calm, laying out the chronology that had become my life. Transfers timed with hotel folios, vendor invoices that fell apart under scrutiny, recordings where Marina spoke of getting out, and laughing about how easy it was to shift funds. I watched the judge's face as she moved through documents, the creases of a career that had seen versions of every domestic drama and yet required proof to do its work. Marina's attorney tried to pivot the narrative to motive. Loneliness, midlife crisis, a search for meaning. He spoke in tones designed to humanize and elicit mercy. I could see some jurors, neighbors and acquaintances sitting in the gallery, soften slightly at his words. But the law is particular. It asks for evidence of conduct that changes financial outcomes, not just words about feeling unloved. Claire threaded the ledger through the recordings, showing that payments were not charitable, not entrepreneurial, but personal. When the judge asked to hear an excerpt of one recording, my stomach tightened. Listening to Marina's own voice, bragging casual, almost bored, about the funds had a way of flattening excuses. She talked about purchases and plans like someone reading a shopping list rather than confessing to a breach of trust. Hearing it aloud in a courtroom was a peculiar humiliation, but it made the abstract concrete. Paul took the stand with a steadiness I did not expect. He described the night he first saw Marina and Rob together, then told of the shame he felt for staying quiet. His voice broke once, at a memory of sitting in the car and pretending not to notice. Andrew testified too, his words fewer but focused on consequence. Tuition paid, nights worked, dinner skipped. The testimony was not melodrama. It was a ledger translated into human terms. Marina's face remained composed throughout most of the day. She had rehearsed defenses and performed them well. But there are moments where the performative cracks. When Claire presented bank statements with highlighted lines and a map connecting transfers to hotel names and courier addresses, I watched Marina's composure wobble. The law does not require theatrical repentance. It requires evidence and consequence. The judge asked difficult procedural questions about chain of custody for recordings, about whether one-party consent applied in our jurisdiction, about the provenance of invoices. Claire answered with clarity. The judge's pen moved across pages, and in that movement I could see the machinery of justice start to engage. When the judge ruled to freeze the contested accounts pending final adjudication, it felt like a small tidal shift. The flow of funds slowed, and with it the ability to finish whatever escape Marina had planned. Outside, cameras and online forums spun speculation into narrative. It is odd how public a private betrayal becomes when courts are involved. I had wanted privacy for Andrew's sake, but once allegations become material, they live elsewhere. The interim ruling did not close the case. Marina's counsel filed motions to dismiss certain exhibits. She claimed misinterpretation. The judge scheduled a longer trial where finer points, intent, timing, and calculation would be examined. It is a grind. Depositions, subpoenas, forensic accountants unfolding months of transactions across banks and vendors. Yet even in procedure, there were small mercies. The freeze prevented further transfers that might have been used to dissolve the trail. The mortgage company agreed to hold off on any action pending the court's decision. These pauses mattered more than I had expected. They allowed a family to breathe while the legal system did its slow work. At night, after hearings, I would return to the small box of recipes I had begun to collect, grounding myself with the exact measures and patient turns that food demands. There is a clarity in placing ingredients in a bowl that the courtroom lacks. No witness will testify to the tenderness of basil. A judge will not weigh a dash of salt. Yet the kitchen became a refuge of ordinary truth. The trial loomed, and with it the need to be precise. I slept poorly some nights, thinking of every invoice, every transfer. The law asks for certainty, and uncertainty is its enemy. So we tightened evidence chains, reaffirmed witness availability, and made sure every record had a path from origin to exhibit. I was not seeking revenge in the theatrical sense. I sought restitution and protection. The judge's preliminary rulings gave me space to breathe and an inch of distance from a plan that had threatened both our finances and our dignity. For Andrew, that was everything. And for me, it clarified a truth. Justice is incremental and mundane, served by paper and testimony as much as by righteous anger. I kept faith in slow, steady truth. In the weeks after the court's preliminary ruling, Marina's bravado thinned. She began missing meetings, her business emails went unanswered, and Rob's calendar, once synced with hers, showed empty slots where dinners and site visits had been. Rumors moved into the gaps he left. It is a particular cruelty to be abandoned by someone you broke for. I had never wished that ruin on anyone, yet I watched the unraveling with detached sorrow. Rob's charm had been transactional, useful until reputation and solvency mattered more than flirtation. When he chose a new partner with money and connections, he shifted alliances without drama, as if reorganizing assets. Word arrived quietly. A mutual acquaintance texted that Rob had been seen at a gala with another woman who moved in investment circles. Business partners began to request proofs of solvency. The absence of Rob made Marina's precarious finances visible in ledger lines and client inquiries. Her enterprise, once touted at mixers, now found suppliers pulling credit and clients asking for audits. Small administrative failures, delayed shipments, unpaid invoices, snowballed into perceptible collapse. Social capital corrodes faster than bank balances. Invitations dwindled. Friends offered polite distance. Shame does its work not with a single blow but with a geography of avoidance. Marina, confronted by shrinking alliances, faced choices she had believed she could ignore. She had traded a steady marriage for a staged future. The mirror now showed brittleness. Rob's departure landed like a finality. He sent one terse message and then withdrew. Marina called, pleaded, and then raged. He answered once and disappeared. In his silence was the practical calculus. When credit and optics mattered, he chose the safer stake. The man who had smirked across the banquet table receded into other circles, leaving Marina exposed. With Rob gone, creditors moved faster. A landlord questioned an unpaid lease tied to the Portland condo. Suppliers issued demands. Banking notices arrived. The court freeze prevented immediate depletion of certain accounts, but funds already diverted showed up as unpaid obligations. The second life she had tried to construct required liquidity it no longer had. A former employee showed up at the lake house with a box of unsent invoices and a USB drive containing client lists. "I didn't want to be part of it," she said. Her act was civic and fearful. The documents filled gaps, aligning invoices to transfers and mapping the previously hidden architecture of Marina and Rob's spending. Those files tightened the case in ways I could present without speculation. Rob's new partner, learning of litigation, distanced herself. Business and romance are different in the public eye. Associations become costs. Word of the distance settled into neighborhood conversations. Marina had miscalculated. The plan she crafted, leave, live well, rely on Rob, collapsed when Rob reassessed his risks. The courtroom continued its work, but the social and commercial consequences were immediate. Suppliers withheld materials, a contractor canceled renovations, and a major client froze a project. Banks sent formal notices. It was a cascade of operational failures that public relations couldn't smooth. Reputation, once a buoy, became another liability. I did not take pleasure in Marina's fall. My aim was restitution for Andrew and protection of the assets we had built. Still, seeing the collapse underscored a hard lesson. Secret choices have material costs when exposed. The law had reduced opportunity for further harm. Social withdrawal and business contraction completed the consequence. Marina tried to repair the damage with guarded apologies and promises to repay, but investors and suppliers hesitated once litigation hit the news. Attempts to sell a car and jewelry produced low offers. Buyers asked about pending claims. A neighbor later told me they saw Marina walking the block, knocking on doors for leads, an image that felt like a kind of public penance. Andrew moved from anger into action, helping organize depositions and learning to read invoices. Paul stayed near, contrite and useful in testimony. Their involvement made the legal battle less abstract and more a family's effort to secure a future. As weeks passed, headlines cooled into local footnotes. The town's conversation shifted away from scandal toward ordinary concerns. For me, that cooling offered a sliver of quiet permission to rebuild. I met a contractor about a downtown space, signed preliminary supplier agreements, and sketched menus that felt grounded in work, not revenge. The collapse of Marina's plan cleared a path, narrow and practical, toward a life that finally could belong to me alone. It was small, steady work that felt honest and oddly redemptive, quietly enriching. After the initial court skirmishes and Rob's absence, Marina's social circle thinned in a way that felt almost domestic. Neighbors stopped bringing casseroles, book club invitations stopped appearing, and a couple who had once been close sent a polite note about being too busy. Social withdrawal is not dramatic. It simply happens. One day you are at the center of dinner party photographs and the next you leave room for someone else. Her business suffered proportionally. Without access to joint funds and with a frozen account, cash flow contracted. Vendors demanded payment. Contractors halted work. A major client postponed a sizable order. The practicalities of small business, timely invoices, dependable supply chains, exposed vulnerabilities. When money stops flowing, reputations falter because trust is transactional. Marina tried to fight back in the only currency she believed valuable: narrative. She issued statements about personal growth and pressed for sympathetic articles that framed her as an unfortunate figure in a midlife story. That strategy has its brief comforts. Sympathetic coverage can buy breathing room. But press releases do not satisfy unpaid vendors nor replace a deposit notice sheltering assets from further dissipation. I kept to practicalities. With Claire's guidance, we moved to enforce preservation orders and prepared the case for trial. We subpoenaed account records, scheduled depositions, and prepared cross-examinations. The legal work felt like a second profession. Precise, patient, and relentlessly administrative. It is strange how leveling paperwork can feel like recentering a life that has been displaced by secrecy. At hearings, witnesses described patterns in simple, unglamorous terms. A series of small, repeated withdrawals, hotel folios, and courier deliveries. The evidence lacked melodrama. It had steadiness. That steadiness was its strength. Judges, like accountants, pay attention to pattern. Where stories fragment, numbers hold. Marina's isolation had another angle. The people closest to her, consultants she had relied upon, colleagues she had networked with, began to distance themselves. Business relationships are built on mutual benefit. In litigation, associations can become liabilities. A partner who once introduced her to clients now avoided calls. Someone who co-hosted an event declined to sign a letter of support. That silence is its own kind of sanction. Emotionally, the toll was visible. In depositions, Marina's voice was strained, then brittle. She tried to reframe choices as searches for meaning rather than theft. The strategy found few converts within the courthouse. The magistrate listened without spectacle. Legal frameworks favor evidence over rhetorical flourish. It is a humbling place to be when your own words must be accounted for and weighed against bank records. Paul remained a hesitant ally. He sat in proceedings and, when asked, recounted nights he had seen Marina with Rob. His testimony was not dramatic. It was the small, stubborn kind that helps courts see a human context. Andrew still visited when he could, offering practical help with organizing exhibits and supporting witnesses. His presence grounded the family in reality rather than rumor. Community judgment can be cruel in private settings. A small group of friends who once defended Marina expressed sorrow but declined involvement. People who had praised her business sense now asked questions in low voices. That kind of distancing is invasive because it deprives a person of the social repair that might allow reintegration. Isolation removes the slow spaces where reputations can be rebuilt. Yet, in the midst of that social withdrawal, there were pockets of ordinary kindness. A neighbor brought over a casserole without asking. An old client sent a note saying he regretted what had happened but hoped everyone could find resolution. Those small acts felt disproportionately meaningful. Evidence that social life is not wholly punitive and that some threads remain that could be woven toward repair. Financial sanctions and social cooling were not identical punishments. Both were consequences. The law could freeze accounts and secure assets, but it could not compel affection or erase hurt. Those things required time and personal labor to re-earn, if they ever could be. For me, the legal work remained priority. Secure the house, protect Andrew's share, and ensure no further dissipation. I thought often about responsibility. Not only hers but mine. Staying silent had allowed patterns to go unchecked, and yet protecting Andrew was necessary. In the evenings I wrote menu notes beside legal memos. A strange pairing of creation and containment. Small acts, paying suppliers promptly, opening the restaurant door to neighbors, speaking plainly in depositions, felt like the truest restitution. Rebuilding trust would be slow. The court could secure assets, but only time and steady work. Opening a restaurant began as a plan scribbled in margins of legal binders and evolved into a daily regimen that tasted of hope. Leasing a small downtown space felt like the right modest step. Room for 10 tables, a counter, and a tiny wood-fired oven. I met with a contractor who nodded at my pantry sketches and promised a sensible timeline. The work that followed was painfully practical. Permits, inspections, supplier vetting, and menu testing. The legal dust still lingered, but the table I built in the kitchen slowly took precedence. Cooking gave me measurable returns, a sauce thickened to the right sheen, an al dente bite that survivors of my grandmother's lessons would recognize, and customers who returned with friends. The restaurant's early days were small miracles. Neighbors who sampled a plate and recommended us, a bakery that supplied crusts, and a florist who provided weekly centerpieces at a discounted rate. Word spread like breadcrumbs. Slow but effective. Andrew called often from Mississippi with updates about his own life and support for the venture. "Dad, you're finally doing what makes you happy," he said one evening, and his voice carried a relief I had not expected. In his messages he sent tips about managing staff schedules and asked about supplier reliability. Practical things that glued us in purpose. His involvement was not performative. It was pragmatic, and it strengthened a bond that crisis had clarified. Business was never instantaneous glory. The first month we had slim margins, long prep hours, and nights when the dishwasher broke at peak time. But we persisted. I worked morning prep, served at lunch, and met with local wedding planners to offer catering for small ceremonies. Ironic, perhaps, given where this all began, but fitting. Celebrations are a human trade, and my kitchen offered one form of restoration after humiliation. Community response shifted in small increments. Regulars began to form. Older couples took table 4 on Thursdays. A local book club booked our back room for discussions and returned for desserts. People who had once sniffed the scandal now tasted my ravioli and offered polite congratulations. That change was not immediate forgiveness. It was the slow accrual of trust built by consistency. Profitability crept up slowly. After initial months of balancing payroll and vendor payments, we reached a point where nightly covers and weekend bookings made the venture sustainable. I kept meticulous books. Old habits die hard, and used transparent accounting practices to ensure the business would not mirror mistakes of the past. Paying suppliers on time felt like moral restitution in a way the courtroom never could articulate. Occasional reminders of the recent past surfaced. A tabloid piece ran a retrospective on the case and juxtaposed it with my opening night photo. Comments below the piece ranged from empathy to snark. I learned to let them be. What mattered was the small community inside the restaurant. The barista who stayed late to help, the dishwasher who showed pride in his work, and the couple who booked our place for anniversaries. People who came to eat were rarely interested in scandal. They wanted good food and honest company. My relationship with Andrew changed in a reparative way. He visited more often, helped with front-of-house work on busy nights, and introduced friends who became loyal customers. "You never asked permission to be happy," he told me over a plate one night, which felt like both reproach and blessing. Our dinners were quieter now, filled with planning and menus rather than subterfuge and ledgers. Financially, the restaurant's success allowed me to finalize some legal arrangements without compromising staff or service. We paid down certain short-term liabilities and created a small scholarship fund for local culinary students. A modest gesture that felt like passing on the second chances life had given us. The fund was not empty philanthropy. It was seeded by sensible margins and honest accounting. Principles I had always preached. Milestones came quietly. Our 100th sold night, the first wedding we catered, a warm review in a regional paper. My grandmother's lasagna became shorthand for comfort in town. Each booking and compliment felt like a stitch mending something frayed. Strangers shared stories over our tables. Job losses, new romances, reconciliations, and I listened. Feeding people gave me purpose. The community returned that kindness with steady patronage and trust. Small payments in gratitude that mattered more than any headline ever could, and time to slowly rebuild. On the morning the final hearing began, I felt an odd calm, as if the weeks of filings and witness lists had emptied the chest of its heaviest air. The courtroom was less crowded this time. The initial frenzy had ebbed into the background hum of municipal life. Claire had arranged the exhibits, and Andrew sat beside me with a folder of his own. Notes, questions, and a steady presence that felt like a gift. The judge reviewed documents with the patience of habit and asked pointed questions about transfers, intent, and whether assets had been dissipated in a manner contrary to the fiduciary obligations of marriage. Our forensic accountant laid out a clear mapping. Transfers timed with hotel stays and courier addresses tied to purchases. The narrative had been built slowly, carefully, like an architectural plan. Now it was being narrated aloud. Marina took the stand and spoke with a voice that seemed smaller than the one who had once announced her leaving at a banquet. She described her actions in a way that sought nuance. Loneliness, a search for identity, a belief she could start anew. Those explanations carried human weight, but the court's task is not to narrate inner lives so much as to resolve the tangible consequences of actions. The judge's ruling, when it arrived, read with precise finality. Section 15, the fidelity clause Marina had once praised, was enforceable in light of the evidence presented. The judge allocated assets in a manner that protected Andrew's inheritance, awarded the lake house to me based on the provenance of the title and the intent of an inheritance, and ordered Marina to cover certain restitution payments from her remaining accounts. The legal language felt dense and exact, the kind of order that turns messy human business into procedural clarity. There was no gloating language in the judgment. The court did not frame the outcome as moral vindication. It framed it as remediation, corrective steps intended to restore balances disrupted by willful dissipation. The judge urged both parties to seek constructive paths forward, a rare note of civility that felt oddly humane in its practicality. After the ruling, paperwork remained. I signed documents that severed the financial ties that had bound us. Clerks stamped forms. Andrew and I sat for a while outside the courthouse in the late morning light, quiet and a little unspooled. We did not need rhetorical flourishes. The work had been done in exhibits and ledgers, not in grand statements. Still, there was a sense of closure that arrived like a gentle weightlifting. Marina, stripped of much and publicly chastened, left the courthouse with a terse statement and a small entourage. I did not watch her go. There was no appetite for spectacle in me. The legal process had been enough. I felt a strange neutrality, part relief, part exhaustion, part sadness, and that composite felt honest. That evening, on what would have been our 36th anniversary, I opened the restaurant for a modest celebration. A book table for family, close friends, and the staff who had worked long nights to get the place running. We lit a single candle on a modest cake and raised glasses. The occasion was not triumphal. It was a recognition that life continued. Bills to pay, menus to tweak, and customers to feed. Andrew stood and said a few words that felt more like a benediction than an address. He spoke about integrity, about the value of steady work, and about moving forward. "You taught me how to balance books and life," he said, and the room laughed softly. His words were not a paean to victory but a map for repair. In private, I signed the final separation papers that made our detachment official. The pen scratch felt like punctuation on a long, difficult sentence. There was a clarity in the act. The line had been drawn, obligations assigned, and the legal frame set. It did not erase the past, but it insulated the future from further erosion. The restaurant provided its own quiet consolation. Plates clattered, wine glasses chimed, and I walked through the dining room feeling the hum of ordinary life, the kind of proof that sustains people day by day. Patrons tasted food that had been made with focus and the knowledge that I was present, fully, in each service. Hospitality offered a modality of repair that the courtroom could not, the repeated act of giving something good to others. Marina's life, reshaped by judgment and social consequence, moved on in ways that were beyond my remit. The law had done its job in defining restitution and protecting assets. Social repair would have to be her work. For me, the final cut was less an act of revenge and more an act of reclamation. Reclaiming space, time, and a future that belonged to me. That night I locked the restaurant door with a measured hand and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, listening to the last table's laughter float out. I felt steadier, ready for steady days ahead. I told you my story because I needed to make sense of it, and because maybe someone out there needs to hear it before they're blindsided. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, what would dignity look like to you after a betrayal like that? Is forgiveness ever necessary, or is dignity better preserved by walking away? What does respect actually mean in a marriage? Mutual care, honesty, or something else? When a partner steals both love and money, is that a single betrayal or two separate crimes against a family? Do you think a restored identity is built from reclaiming what was lost, or by building something new entirely? Tell me, did I do the right thing fighting through the courts, or should some wounds be handled privately? What would responsibility look like to you, for the betrayed, for the betrayer, and for family members caught in the middle? Drop your thoughts below. Be honest, be kind, and tell me where you stand. Dignity, respect, family betrayal, restored identity, and infidelity. What do those words mean to you after hearing my story? Share your take. I'll be reading the comments.